The autumn of 1941 brought with it the shadow of annihilation. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, had shattered borders and rolled across the steppe like a storm of steel. By October, German panzers had driven deep into Russia, capturing Smolensk and pushing toward the greatest prize of all, Moscow. For Hitler, the Soviet capital was not only a military objective but a symbol. He believed that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. The German plan was bold and merciless. 3 massive army groups fanned out across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, drove along the Smolensk-Moscow axis with 2 armored spearheads, Panzer Groups 2 and 3, under the legendary tank commanders Guderian and Hoth. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and scattering survivors eastward. By early October, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to take Moscow before winter. A massive double envelopment encircled Soviet forces at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing nearly 700,000 men. The road to Moscow seemed open. German officers boasted that the Red Capital would fall within weeks, but the Soviets did not break. Stalin, ruthless and immovable, issued Order Number 227, not one step back, and directed fresh divisions into the path of the German advance. Entire factories were uprooted and moved east beyond the Urals, while workers who remained in Moscow built defenses around their city with shovels and bare hands. Civilians dug anti-tank ditches, laid barbed wire, and erected barricades. In Red Square, as the enemy drew near, Stalin presided over the famous November 7th parade. Columns of Soviet troops marched past the Kremlin and went directly to the front, their boots crunching snow already stained with blood. Nature itself turned against the invaders. The Russian autumn dissolved roads into oceans of mud. Tanks bogged down to their turrets, supply trucks mired axle-deep, horses collapsed in the muck. The infamous Rasputitsa slowed the German advance to a crawl, giving the Red Army precious time. Still, the panzers inched forward, sometimes no more than a few miles per day, trading speed for desperation. By late November, frost hardened the mud, and the Wehrmacht pushed again. German patrols reached the outer suburbs of Moscow, so close they claimed they could see the Kremlin's spires through field glasses. Soldiers dug into frozen earth, believing the city was already theirs. The temperature plunged to 20, then 30 degrees Celsius. Lubricants froze solid, machine guns jammed, and engines refused to start. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find, scavenging from barns and villages. Frostbite blackened hands and feet. Thousands of men collapsed without a shot fired. Yet still the battle raged. Soviet forces, commanded by General Zhukov, launched desperate counterattacks. Siberian divisions, hardened by Arctic winters and released from the eastern frontier after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack, arrived in Moscow like ghosts of the snow. Clad in white camouflage, they glided over skis and struck the exhausted Germans with sudden ferocity. The Wehrmacht, stretched to its limits, faced not only Soviet resistance, but also the unforgiving Russian winter, a foe no general could outmaneuver. The fighting grew monstrous. Villages around Moscow became fortresses, each house contested, each street fought over in brutal close quarters. Men bayoneted each other in barns, burned alive in dugouts, struck by incendiaries, froze where they fell in snowdrifts turned red with blood. Artillery thundered day and night, its blasts muffled by blizzards. The air reeked of cordite, smoke, and the sickly sweet stench of unburied dead. By December, the Germans were spent. Their supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, choked by partisans who ambushed convoys and tore up rails. Ammunition dwindled, fuel evaporated, food became scarce. Horses gnawed on bark, men on frozen scraps. A soldier's breath froze on his lips as he tried to load his rifle. Moscow still stood. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets struck back. The temperature had plunged to nearly 40 degrees Celsius, and the Germans were at the limits of endurance. Zhukov unleashed a massive counteroffensive along a broad front, spearheaded by the fresh Siberian divisions and reinforced by tanks and artillery pulled from deep reserves. The Red Army surged forward like an avalanche. The Germans, caught completely off balance, reeled backward. Their troops, already suffering from frostbite and starvation, now faced Soviet soldiers adapted to the cold and equipped with winter gear. Soviet T-34 tanks, with their wide tracks and reliable engines, plowed easily through snowdrifts that immobilized the narrower-tracked German panzers. Cavalry units on skis appeared out of blizzards, cutting off retreating columns. The Wehrmacht, so accustomed to being the hunter, now became the hunted. German command collapsed into panic. Field Marshal von Bock urged withdrawal, but Hitler forbade retreat. Not one step back, he declared, ironically echoing Stalin's own order. German soldiers were commanded to hold villages until the last man, even as Soviet artillery pulverized them and infantry swarmed through. The results were catastrophic. Entire regiments annihilated, supply depots captured, rear areas overrun. By mid-December, the Soviet counterattack had driven the Germans back 100 to 150 miles from Moscow. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital evaporated. Hitler dismissed von Bock and other commanders, raging at what he saw as betrayal. In truth, the Wehrmacht had reached its breaking point. More men died of exposure than combat. Frozen corpses were stacked like logs, their rifles still slung over their shoulders. Horses froze standing, still harnessed to carts. The Soviets pressed their advantage, but their own casualties were staggering. Soldiers advanced through waist-deep snow, often without proper boots, leaving trails of blood from frost-bitten feet. Rifle barrels split from the cold, and men huddled around burning wrecks for warmth, only to be shelled again. Yet morale was unbroken. For the first time since June, the Red Army had not only survived but turned back the invader. The battlefield around Moscow became a wasteland of frozen death. Villages reduced to blackened shells, forests shredded by artillery, fields littered with wreckage. In some places, frozen German and Soviet soldiers lay locked together, rifles in hand, preserved by the cold as if the battle had ended only moments ago. Survivors spoke of wolves prowling no man's land, feeding on corpses too numerous to bury. By January 1942, the Germans had been driven back from the very gates of Moscow. The Soviet capital was scarred but unbroken. Stalin, who had refused to flee even when the enemy was within artillery range, proclaimed victory. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Blitzkrieg, unstoppable in France and the Balkans, had broken on the icy threshold of Moscow. The consequences were enormous. For the first time in the war, Hitler's armies had suffered a major strategic defeat. The illusion of a swift campaign was gone. The conflict in the east would be long, grinding, and merciless. German morale sank, while Soviet confidence surged. The Red Army, though bloodied and battered, had proven it could stand against the Wehrmacht. In Berlin, the shock was palpable. The propaganda machine struggled to explain why Moscow still stood, why victory had not come. In Moscow, life began to return to a semblance of normality. The November parade was remembered not as a desperate gamble, but as a symbol of defiance fulfilled. The Battle of Moscow had cost the Soviets more than 1 million casualties, dead, wounded, or captured, but it had saved the capital and preserved the Soviet state. For the Germans, it marked the first great failure of Operation Barbarossa, the moment when the dream of conquering Russia in a single campaign dissolved forever. The winter snows eventually covered the wreckage, burying the dead beneath a silent white shroud. But beneath that snow lay the echoes of the greatest battle the world had yet seen, an inferno of fire and ice where millions clashed and where history itself turned. Moscow did not fall, and in not falling, it ensured that Hitler's empire would one day collapse in ruins.